The deadly nerve gas attack in the suburbs of the Syrian capital in August was orchestrated by an al-Qaeda-linked group backed by Saudi Arabia. And that's according to Russian diplomatic sources speaking on condition of anonymity. Well, the Interfax news agency reports this, and our Middle East correspondent Paula Sleer has more on this.
This is the position that Moscow has held all along, namely that the rebels are provoking the situation as an attempt to see foreign forces and the international community becoming involved in the conflict inside Syria. Both Moscow and Damascus believe that there is more than enough evidence that points to the opposition being behind this attack. And yet, despite the huge body of evidence, the United States and her allies continue to put the blame for this attack on the shoulders of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This is also despite the fact that a number of former high-ranking members of the American intelligence community have themselves said that there is a lot of evidence that points to the fact that, in fact, it may very well have been the rebels behind this attack. Now, what is also important to point out is that this intelligence community says that there's a growing body of evidence that shows, number one, that the attack was pre-planned, and number two, that its aim was to see the United States becoming involved in the conflict. They also say that it is in Israel's interest to see military intervention in Syria, but not to the point that the opposition would be strengthened enormously in the long run. The United States remains committed to seeing the overthrow of the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and it continues to support a very fractured opposition. This despite the fact that even Western analysis says that the opposition is becoming increasingly more and more radicalized, as you have groups like al-Qaeda that are becoming more and more powerful.
Meanwhile, experts from the world's chemical weapons watchdog say they are making encouraging progress towards dismantling Syria's stockpiles. A team from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is in Damascus for talks with officials. A UN report earlier concluded that nerve gas had indeed been used on a large scale in August, but the consistency of the findings are under question, as Oksana Boyko explained to my colleague Yulia Shapovalova.
The report on the use of chemical weapons, the first report was released a couple of weeks ago. The next report is expected by the end of the year, and this is going to be the full report. But inspectors claim to use very robust, very reliable scientific methods. But if you actually go and look at the report, there are so many questions, and the main question is, of course, the reliability of the whole research, because just to explain you quickly, what the inspectors did, they went to several sites around the Ghouta area, the area that produced that horrible videos of dead children and dead bodies, and at one location they spent around 2 hours, at another location they spent around 5 hours, and they tried to collect samples, environmental samples, tissues, fabrics, soil, and also interview survivors and take blood samples from them. And the biggest problem there is that none of the environmental samples that they took in West Ghouta tested positively for sarin, but all the survivors, for some reason, tested positively. I suggest we listen to one of the sound bites from the interview that I did with Angela Kane, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. I think that would put things into perspective.
They did prove that sarin was evident in the samples they found, but on the other hand, if they did not find samples in the environmental samples, if they did not find sarin in the environmental samples, it just testifies to the honesty of the inspections, that they're saying, this is what we found, this is what we took.
Now, of course, it's interesting that Ms. Kane would talk about the honesty of the inspectors. I think we would expect nothing less from the UN personnel, but you need to understand what actually happened. Whenever the investigators had a chance to do that job, whenever they had a freedom to go around and collect samples, none of them test positively. And yet, whenever they tried to get some tissue samples from people who were pre-selected by the opposition, they all test positively. And this is statistically, it's simply impossible. I mean, there are just two possible explanations. Either the United Nations inspectors didn't know how to do their job and, you know, collect those environmental samples, or the opposition tried to influence the investigation and brought people who were probably exposed to sarin, but at some other location, and you make your pick. I mean, it's up to you who you trust more, the UN inspectors or the opposition. What I find extremely interesting and inexplicable to me is that the UN inspectors and the UN report would still claim that they have clear and convincing evidence that sarin was used, whereas, as we just discussed, those evidence are neither clear nor consistent.
But still, the investigation is continuing, of course. But, of course, the reported death toll of the mass chemical attack near Damascus ranges from hundreds to thousands. Well, actually, did the inspectors examine the bodies themselves?
Well, it is also a very interesting case because we all remember that, you know, those pictures of dead children and dead bodies were the main case for President Obama, the main reason for President Obama to go to war in Syria. He wanted to punish President Assad for killing all those people. And what's strange is that the UN inspectors didn't even request to see neither of those bodies. They didn't want to see the autopsies. They didn't want to go to the morgues. And this is how Ms. Kane explained the reasons why none of such requests were made.
There were so many victims who were still alive that there was really no need to exhume bodies and basically take tissue from them, because there were so many victims who were alive, but we had also complete case history, meaning that the victims were able to tell how they were affected, what they felt, what the symptoms were, which is much more powerful than taking tissue from a body.
Well, in my humble opinion, autopsies are a very, very rich source of any sort of information. And moreover, the UN inspectors cite a lot of stories about, a lot of interviews about how many people were killed. At some point in the report, they say that there were like a family of 40 people killed in Zamalka. And yet, for some reason, they make absolutely no effort to go and see those bodies.